Imagine having 50,000 people screaming hatred at you, calling you names you can't repeat on television. Most men would crumble. But Babe Ruth? He pointed to the exact spot where he was going to hit the ball, and then did it. This is the story of sport's greatest called shot and the mystery that still divides baseball fans today. It was October 1st, 1932, and America was in the depths of the Great Depression. Banks had failed, factories had closed, and millions of people were out of work. But in Chicago, there was still baseball, and baseball meant hope. The World Series had come to Wrigley Field, and the hometown Cubs were facing the mighty New York Yankees. This wasn't just any World Series. This was personal. The Chicago Cubs had been Babe Ruth's victims before, but this time was different. The Cubs players had been mercilessly heckling Ruth and his teammate Lou Gehrig throughout the series. They called Ruth old, washed up, finished. They made cruel jokes about his weight and his age. Some of the insults were so vicious that newspapers couldn't print them. But the Cubs had made one critical mistake. They had challenged the Bambino. The tension had been building since Game 1. The Yankees had won the first 2 games of the series convincingly, with Ruth contributing significantly to both victories. But it was what happened between the games that really set the stage for drama. Cubs manager Charlie Grimm had made it clear to his players that psychological warfare was their only chance against the superior Yankees lineup. Get under Ruth's skin, he told them, make him angry. Angry players make mistakes. They succeeded in making him angry. They just didn't count on what an angry Babe Ruth was capable of. The morning of Game 3 dawned crisp and clear in Chicago. Wrigley Field was packed to capacity with 49,986 fans, most of them hoping to see their Cubs stay alive in the series. The atmosphere was electric, but also hostile. From the moment Ruth stepped onto the field for batting practice, the boos began. Hey, Ruth, you fat has-been. Your belly's bigger than your bat. Time to retire, old man. Ruth, now 37 years old and clearly past his prime, seemed to absorb every insult with a smile. His teammates later said they'd never seen him so focused, so determined to prove something. But the real fireworks started when Ruth came to bat in the first inning. The Cubs' dugout exploded with taunts as Ruth approached the plate. Charlie Root, Chicago's starting pitcher, was known for his aggressive style and willingness to throw inside. The Cubs players were shouting instructions to Root. Knock him down. Show him who's boss. Ruth fouled off the first pitch, and the crowd roared its approval. The second pitch was a ball outside. Then Root delivered a strike that Ruth took for strike 1. The jeering reached a crescendo, but Ruth did something that silenced the crowd momentarily. He stepped out of the batter's box, turned toward the Cubs' dugout, and held up one finger. It was as if he was saying, "That's one." The crowd interpreted this as Ruth acknowledging the strike count, but his teammates said later they could see something different in his eyes. He was making a statement. Ruth grounded out weakly to end the inning, and the Cubs' dugout erupted in celebration. They thought they had broken him. They were wrong. The game continued with both teams trading runs. Ruth came up again in the third inning and struck out swinging, much to the delight of the Cubs fans. The taunts grew even louder. Someone in the stands threw a lemon that rolled near Ruth's feet. He picked it up, smiled, and tossed it back into the crowd. This wasn't the reaction the Cubs were expecting. By the fifth inning, the game was tied 4-4. The tension in Wrigley Field was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Both teams knew that this could be the turning point of the series. The Cubs needed to win to stay alive. The Yankees wanted to close out the championship. And then came the moment that would live forever in sports history. Ruth stepped into the batter's box to face Charlie Root for what would be their final confrontation of the afternoon. The Cubs dugout unleashed their most vicious barrage of insults yet. Players were standing on the top step screaming at Ruth with veins bulging in their necks. Root's first pitch was a called strike. Ruth didn't swing, but he didn't step out of the box either. Instead, he turned toward the Cubs dugout and held up one finger again. The crowd booed lustily. The second pitch was also a strike, this one on the outside corner. Root had Ruth down 0-2, exactly where he wanted him. The Cubs players were beside themselves with excitement, certain that their psychological warfare had finally worked. But then something extraordinary happened. Ruth stepped out of the batter's box and did something that has been debated for 90 years. According to some witnesses, he pointed directly toward the center field bleachers. According to others, he was pointing at the Cubs dugout or at pitcher Charlie Root. Still others claimed he was simply gesturing in response to the crowd's taunts. But what happened next is undisputed. Ruth stepped back into the box. Root delivered his next pitch, and Ruth connected with a swing that produced one of the most majestic home runs in baseball history. The ball sailed high and deep toward center field, traveling an estimated 440 feet before landing in the exact area where witnesses claimed Ruth had pointed. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, the entire stadium seemed frozen in time. 50,000 Cubs fans watched in stunned silence as the ball disappeared into the bleachers. Even the Cubs players in the dugout seemed momentarily speechless. Then Ruth began his famous home run trot. As he rounded first base, Ruth looked toward the Cubs dugout with an expression that can only be described as satisfaction mixed with vindication. By the time he reached second base, he was laughing. At third base, he tipped his cap to the crowd that had been tormenting him all afternoon. When he crossed home plate, his Yankees teammates were waiting to mob him, but Ruth's attention was focused elsewhere. He looked directly at the Cubs dugout and made a gesture that seemed to say, "What do you have to say now?" The Cubs players and fans were devastated. They had thrown everything they had at the Bambino, and he had responded with perhaps the most clutch home run in World Series history. But the story doesn't end there. What happened next showed the true character of Babe Ruth and why he became more than just a baseball player. He became an American icon. Instead of celebrating excessively or taunting his tormentors, Ruth simply rounded the bases with dignity. When he returned to the Yankees dugout, he didn't boast about his achievement. According to his teammates, he simply said, "I told you I'd get him." The psychological impact on the Cubs was immediate and devastating. They never recovered from that moment. The Yankees went on to win Game 3 by a score of 7-5, and they would sweep Game 4 the next day to claim their third World Series championship in 4 years. But the legend of the called shot was just beginning. Immediately after the game, reporters rushed to get Ruth's version of what had happened. Did he really point to where he was going to hit the home run? Ruth's answer was typically cryptic. "I never told them where I was going to hit it, but I sure let them know it was going." Over the years, Ruth would give different versions of the story. Sometimes he confirmed that he had indeed called his shot. Other times he seemed to suggest that the whole thing had been blown out of proportion by the press and fans who wanted to believe in something magical. The truth, as is often the case with legends, probably lies somewhere in between. What we do know for certain is that several reliable witnesses, including reporters and players from both teams, confirmed that Ruth made some kind of gesture before hitting the home run. Whether it was pointing to center field, pointing at the Cubs dugout, or simply responding to the crowd's taunts, Ruth definitely did something deliberate and dramatic. We also know that Ruth was fully aware of the psychological warfare being waged against him, and that he was the kind of player who thrived under pressure. The bigger the moment, the better Ruth seemed to perform. Lou Gehrig, who was batting behind Ruth that day and had one of the best views of the entire sequence, always maintained that Ruth had indeed pointed to center field before hitting the home run. "Babe definitely called his shot," Gehrig would say years later. "I saw him do it." Charlie Root, the Cubs pitcher who threw the fateful pitch, went to his grave denying that Ruth had called the home run. "If he had pointed to the bleachers, I would have knocked him down with the next pitch," Root insisted. "No pitcher lets a batter show him up like that." The Cubs catcher that day, Gabby Hartnett, had perhaps the best view of anyone. His account was more nuanced. Ruth definitely did something before he hit that home run. Whether he was pointing to center field or just responding to our bench jockeys, I can't say for sure. But he knew he was going to do something special. The debate raged for decades, but it really didn't matter whether Ruth had literally called his shot or not. What mattered was what the moment represented. This was 1932, remember. The country was struggling through the worst economic crisis in its history. People needed heroes. They needed someone who could stand up to pressure and deliver when it mattered most. They needed someone who could look adversity in the eye and say, "Is that all you've got?" Babe Ruth provided exactly that. The called shot became more than just a baseball story. It became a metaphor for American resilience, for the idea that you could face down any challenge if you had enough confidence and determination. It represented the belief that sometimes, if you're good enough and brave enough, you can actually deliver on even the most outrageous promises. Hollywood certainly understood the power of the story. Multiple movies have featured versions of the called shot, each one portraying Ruth as larger than life, a man who could bend reality to his will through sheer force of personality. But perhaps the most telling evidence for what really happened that day comes from the reaction of the Cubs fans themselves. These were people who had spent the entire game hurling abuse at Ruth, who desperately wanted their team to succeed. Yet many of them later admitted that when Ruth connected with that pitch, they found themselves amazed rather than angry. "You had to admire the man," one Cubs fan told a reporter years later. "He took everything we could dish out and then showed us why he was the greatest player who ever lived." The called shot also marked a turning point in Ruth's legacy. This was his final World Series appearance, and he was clearly past his prime. His reflexes were slower, his swing not quite as quick as it had been in his younger days. Critics had begun to suggest that Father Time was catching up with the Bambino, but in that one magical moment at Wrigley Field, Ruth proved that greatness isn't just about physical ability. It's about mental toughness, about the ability to perform under pressure, about having the confidence to back up your words with actions. The home run itself was measured at 440 feet, making it one of the longest ever hit at Wrigley Field up to that point. But the distance wasn't what made it special. What made it special was the context, the timing, and the sheer audacity of the moment. Think about what Ruth accomplished that day. He absorbed the hatred of 50,000 people and the psychological warfare of an entire opposing team, then responded with perhaps the most clutch performance of his career. He didn't just hit a home run. He hit the exact home run that the moment demanded. That's the difference between a good player and a great one. Good players rise to the occasion. Great players create the occasion. The called shot also demonstrated something else important about Babe Ruth's character. He could have easily responded to the Cubs' taunts with anger or bitterness. Instead, he responded with confidence and ultimately respect for his opponents. After the game, Ruth didn't criticize the Cubs for their psychological tactics. He understood that they were trying to gain any advantage they could against a superior team. They were just trying to win, he said later. I can't fault them for that. This magnanimity in victory was part of what made Ruth such a beloved figure, even among opposing fans. He played the game with joy and passion, but he also played it with a kind of dignity that transcended team loyalties. The legacy of the called shot has only grown over time. It has become baseball's version of a folk tale, a story that gets better with each telling. Some details may have been embellished over the years, but the core truth remains. On one October afternoon in 1932, Babe Ruth did something that seemed to defy the laws of probability and human psychology. Modern sports psychologists have studied the called shot as an example of what they call optimal performance under pressure. According to their analysis, Ruth demonstrated several key characteristics that allow athletes to excel in high-pressure situations. Focus on the task at hand, confidence in his abilities, and the mental strength to ignore external distractions. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the called shot is how it has inspired generations of athletes who came after Ruth. Countless players have attempted their own versions of calling their shots, though few have done so in such dramatic circumstances or with such spectacular results. Michael Jordan's famous flu game in the 1997 NBA Finals, Joe Namath's Super Bowl III guarantee, and Kirk Gibson's injured home run in the 1988 World Series all echo elements of Ruth's called shot. They represent moments when athletes transcended their physical limitations through sheer force of will. The debate over what exactly happened on October 1, 1932, will probably never be fully resolved. But in a way, that's part of the story's enduring appeal. Like all great legends, it leaves room for our imagination to fill in the details. What we can say with certainty is that Babe Ruth, facing the most hostile environment of his career, delivered one of the most memorable performances in sports history. Whether he literally called his shot or not, he answered his critics in the most emphatic way possible, and maybe that's the real lesson of the called shot. Sometimes the best response to your doubters isn't words, it's results. Sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply doing what you do best, when it matters most. In the end, the called shot represents everything that made Babe Ruth special: the confidence, the flair for the dramatic, the ability to perform under pressure, and the understanding that sports can be about more than just winning and losing. They can be about creating moments that people will remember long after the final score is forgotten. 90 years later, we're still talking about what happened that day at Wrigley Field. We're still debating the details, still marveling at the audacity of the moment. That perhaps more than any statistical achievement is the true measure of Babe Ruth's greatness. He didn't just play baseball, he created legends. And the called shot may be the greatest legend of them all.